Chapter-13. The Monastery at Baranagar. In 1886, after the departure of Sri Ramakrishna, I renounced the world and became a sannyasin, along with Swami Vivekananda and the other co-disciples, the Guru Bhais. As this was our second birth, we gave up our former names, and from that time I have been known by my present name. Thus writes Swami Abhedananda. The scene now shifted from the Kosapur garden house to the new monastery at Baranagar. But the story must be told in its proper perspective. It is on record that in the last few days of Sri Ramakrishna's earthly life, he entrusted the care and training of his other disciples, themselves all boys of profound spirituality, to Naren's hands, and imparted to him his final instructions. Verily, the leadership of the newly created Brotherhood of Ramakrishna devolved on Naren, the greatest of his apostles, to whom the Master had transmitted all the spiritual powers that he had acquired through the years of austerity and experience. Naturally, his leadership was therefore unquestioned. Swami Abhedananda, who was junior to Swami Vivekananda by 3 years, was one of the close associates when both of them appeared on the world platform. Those who have carefully read the Jamshedpur speech and other public addresses of Abhedananda in India must have seen his attitude towards Vivekananda, whose biddings he always followed. It is interesting to note that it was at Kosapur that, as the days of his teachings were coming to a close, that Sri Ramakrishna himself strengthened the bonds between Naren and his other brother disciples, always indicating to them to accept Naren as the central figure. Since the days at Dakshineswar, as my association grew more and more intimate with Naren, I began to regard him as my elder and leader. This was equally true of the rest of us. It was also due to the Master's high estimate of his spiritual worth. This statement of Swami Abhedananda is worth remembering. The remarkable personality of Swami Vivekananda no doubt contributed largely to his leadership. In fact, it was Sri Ramakrishna who told his young boys that when he would be no more in the physical form, Naren would then become their leader. But it was perhaps at the Kosapur garden house, where all the 11 were assembled together for the first time to nurse him, that the Master made them feel that the spiritual understanding of his chief disciple should be their infallible guide in the days that were to come. Now let us see how and in what way the leadership of Naren rose to the occasion when the day actually came following the passing away of the Master. Thus Vivekananda had the authority of Sri Ramakrishna himself as regards his future leadership for the newly created Brotherhood, which was destined to usher in a new era in India insofar as her spiritual and cultural regeneration was concerned. Of course, the spiritual life of the boys were perfectly molded by the Master, but it was left to one to keep his brother disciples together when the physical frame of Sri Ramakrishna would be removed from their sight. Not only to keep them together, but to guide and train them also. This was the main task that awaited Naren at the monastery at Baranagar. Thus saddled with a great responsibility, he had hardly any time to pass his days in bereavement, and he at once set himself to the task, shouting inwardly, "Victory to Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna." But it would be a travesty of truth to say that it was Naren's spirit alone that sustained these fiery souls in those days of desolation and held his brother disciples together. The biographers of Swami Vivekananda seldom mention in this connection about one silent and self-effacing benign figure. We are speaking here of Sharada Devi, the Holy Mother. It was under her loving care that the young boys lived at the Kosapur garden house as a happy family. When the Master departed from the scene of his Leela, it was the sympathy of the mother that brought blessing and hope to the boys. In the words of Vivekananda, she was a woman, that lady, his wife, was the only one who sympathized with her spiritual sons, and we could not have remained together then but for the loving care and inspiration of the mother. In fact, and also historically speaking, when the master departed, it fell on his divine consort, Sharada Devi, who herself was a living embodiment of all the highest and noblest virtues of an Indian woman, to gather round her all the disciples of her husband who have left their home and hearth, and to bestow on them the motherly affection and care. This ultimately paved the path to the establishment of the monastic order, which was the cherished dream of Sri Ramakrishna. The young disciples stayed at the Kosipur garden house till the lease expired. Their grief, together with the pressure of their guardians, now exerted upon them to return to their homes and live a normal life, and it might have disbanded them had it not been for Naren, who was determined to hold them together against all odds. On one side there was dire poverty, on the other renunciation and devotion. They had to pass through various ordeals, internal and external, before they emerged as apostles of a new faith, the faith which was to show to the world that the work of the man of Dakshineswar was not to end with the death of the body, and which was also to express itself in an eternal flow of spiritual life and knowledge of the indestructible. It was but natural that after the passing away of the Master, the young disciples would become at first bewildered to realize what to do. The first question was that of a shelter which would be needed after 1 month. Some of the disciples had already left their homes and were living in the house at Kosipur, and the others were about to leave their home to join the rest. The memories of their master held them together, and they spent most of the time in meditation, singing, and also in recalling over and over again the last days of Sri Ramakrishna, as also the memorable days at Dakshineswar. And yet, at the same time, the young disciples, under the leadership of Naren, were seriously engaged in discussing among themselves about the mission and the teachings of their master. In short, a great spirit filled the whole place and throbbed with wonderful vitality and power. It was against this background that the monastery at Branagar was about to take its shape as the nucleus of the future Ramakrishna Muth and mission, the full history of which has been recorded in the book History of the Ramakrishna Muth and Mission. The inquisitive reader or listener would do well to go through this remarkable book, from which we quote the following lines, having special bearing on our narration. Meanwhile, the budding monastery at Kosipur got uprooted, and the youth scattered to different parts of North India. The future looked gloomy so far as their organized monastic life was concerned. One evening, when Surendranath Mitra, a householder devotee, was in his shrine, Sri Ramakrishna appeared to him in a vision and said, "What are you doing? My boys are roaming about without a shelter. First find some remedy for that." This excited Surendra, who rushed at once to Naren and said, "Brother, fix an abode where the master's picture and ashes and the articles of his daily use can be kept and worshipped regularly, and where the all-renouncing devotees like you can live together in unity." Needless to say that Naren jumped at the idea. He started at once in search of a house and wrote to Tarak at Vrindavan to keep himself ready to return at a moment's notice. Naren ransacked the suburbs of Calcutta for a house on easy terms, for he had not much money to spare. Surendra had promised to pay monthly the amount he used to spend at Kosipur Garden. At last, Naren chose a dilapidated house near the Ganges at Baranagar, a little way above Kosipur. The rent was fixed at 11 rupees a month, and 6 rupees went to the cook. The other expenses were for the plainest food and clothing. So the monastery at Baranagar came into being at that dilapidated house. But what a house it was! In the words of Swami Vijayananda, the Muth was located in the upper story of the back western portion of the dilapidated and neglected temple precincts of the Munshis of Taki on the Promenade Ghat Road in Baranagar. As one entered through a door from the road and crossed a small open space, one came to a staircase leading up to a veranda with pillars and wood railings, on the right side of which, in the front portion, there was a big room. The inner portion used for the muth could not be seen from outside. It was desolate. The ground floor was full of the dirt of the ages and so covered with weeds that it became the resort of snakes and jackals. Nobody approached the house. It was regarded as haunted, and nobody cared to take it on lease. There was a hall on the left which served as the bedroom of the monks, as well as a parlor to receive visitors and devotees. Thus, it was in this dilapidated and haunted house that about 3/4 of a century ago, seeds of the Ramakrishna movement that was to sweep the world were laid down. It was more than a century now. This monastery was, in fact, a strange innovation in Bengal. Strange in this sense, that there was in here a wretched house came to live a band of educated young men of cultured families, all dressed in ochre cloths of full width and with the monistic philosophy as their main belief, while adopting for practical purposes devotion, meditation, study, and other forms of spiritual discipline. They even changed their family names in order to wipe out all links with the past, which was something socially objectionable. All things combined, the new movement seemed to be crazy and beyond the grasp of the common people. It was no easy task to build up a monastery and a monastic life in the midst of so much an unenlightened apathy and prejudice. Here, in a few words about the historical implications of the Ramakrishna movement may be not altogether out of the point. The teachings of Sri Ramakrishna could not have spread so successfully and so widely without the Ramakrishna movement, which, so to say, began in a nucleus form at the dirty and dilapidated monastery at Baranagar. The sadhana that began at Dakshineswar actually found its historical fulfillment when this movement began under the leadership of Vivekananda and Abhedananda towards the close of the 19th century. This statement may sound startling, but it is true in the true sense of the word. In the words of Christopher Isherwood, the movement must be regarded as the most important of all existing religious movements, no matter how large or influential or venerable the others may be. It is always hard to recognize the power and magnitude of a new spiritual force, and the Ramakrishna movement is very new, historically speaking. Not only spiritual, the social role it played is equally significant, and the founders of this movement were well fitted for the task. They intended from the beginning, it may be pointed out, that the spiritual aspect of the movement should not be confined to the East only. It must serve the West as well. And the subsequent history of the movement bears ample testimony to it. We have indicated already that historical forces were behind this movement almost from the beginning, and the leaders connected with it were fully possessed of the keen historical sense as they went from the East to the West. The Ramakrishna movement differs from the earlier religious movements in India and elsewhere in this sense that from the very inception of it, avoided the much more deadly mistake of trying to create a tradition of itself. As we all knew, it never confined to meditation and retirement from the world. The course of the movement had all along run on two planes, the mission and the muth, or the monastery, and unless we take into account this dual character of the movement, it will not be possible for us to realize its significance. While the mission, with all its hospitals, schools, and relief projects, is necessarily involved in the affairs of the world, the muth remains as the spiritual structure for the erring and afflicted humanity at large. Now we revert to our narration. Established in the month of October 1886, the monastery at the dreary and desolate place of Baranagar remained at this place for a period of 6 years, after which it was removed to Alabazar, in the neighborhood of Dakshineswar, and thence was finally removed to Belur towards the close of the 19th century. The history of its growth and development has been fully described in the book referring to, and we need not dwell on it at length. Let us now see how the boys began their new life as monks in that weird place, infested with lizards and snakes, and surrounded by a jungle-like garden full of weeds and with a pond at the back covered with green scum, which was a breeding place for mosquitoes. It was in this way that a new era of spiritual renaissance began at that haunted house and amidst conditions beyond our imagination. And nothing but the spirit of the Master could really sustain these consecrated souls confined there. Taken all in all, the life of this new monastery presented to them an acid test to their character, and how they surmounted it is a story often told, and we need not recapitulate it here. The dreary retreat was chosen because of its cheapness and its nearness to the holy Ganges and the Baranagar burning ghat, where the body of the Master had been consigned to the flame. It was at this place that the young apostles, already informally initiated to sannyasa by their Master, took formal vows in the presence of one another, and thus came into being the Ramakrishna order. The story of Baranagar Monastery, therefore, is the story of the 11 young men of total renunciation, caught up in the fervor of spiritual longing. A few days after the young monks had settled at Baranagar Monastery, there came an invitation quite unexpectedly from the mother of Babaram, one of the monks, Swami Paramahansa, to make a trip to Anpur, his native village. The boys, headed by Naren, their leader, went there and were cordially received. Adpur, a small village in Hooghly, meant a starting point in the lives of the spiritual sons of Sri Ramakrishna, who himself was born in the same district. For it is here that the new communion of apostles was founded amid tears of love in memory of the lost master, as Romain Rolland puts it. And what this new communion exactly meant has been fully explained in the main biography of Swami Vivekananda, from which we give here the following quotation. Here, the light of their combined spiritual fire blazed into a tremendous conflagration. Naren's religious enthusiasm added fuel to the flame. It seemed as if the spirit of the Master was speaking and working through him. He was intensely possessed of the living vision of the sannyasin's life and would cry out, "Let man-making be the goal of our lives. Let us make this our only sadhana. The realization of God is the one and sole thing in life." That is what Sri Ramakrishna's life represented. We must realize God. The boys, inspired by these thoughts and fired by oneness of purpose, became aware of the sense of unity, a feeling that they were all inseparably connected by some wonderful spiritual power, making them brothers. And during their stay at Anpur, they seemed to grow into one body, one mind, and one soul. But this was not all that happened at Anpur. Much more than that came in their lives of the Blessed 11. There, one night before a huge dhuni in the compound of the house, they gathered together and meditated for a long time. There was peace all around and also peace within. As they stood before the dhuni with the flames lighting upon their countenances, they took the vow of sannyasa before God and one another. This happened on Christmas Eve. The temple of Tarakshwar was not far off, and they all went there to worship the Lord of the monks, and finally returned to Baranagar to lead a life of absolute austerity and renunciation. Thus began a new chapter in the lives of those destined to give to the world what is needed most, truth and love. They were to demonstrate that love for God has very little meaning in it if not coupled with love for humanity. That religion embraced the suffering humanity and the world within its arms. Thus, the spiritual significance of the Brahmanagar Muth held its lamp to light the way of humanity.